Hi guys, Nigel Howitt here of lawfulrebel.com, welcoming you to episode 180 of Living Outside the Matrix, the podcast where we examine important issues either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. In this episode, it's a great pleasure to be welcoming Derrick Broze of the Conscious Resistance Network. He's a long-time researcher, thinker and writer. He's a public speaker and he's been organising the People's Reset events in Mexico and recently in the UK. Derrick, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today, mate, and a warm welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, brother. I appreciate it. Thanks for all that you do as well.
Derrick, by way of introduction, and keep it relatively brief, but I'm curious, you're a truth seeker and somebody that's obviously a passion for thinking and finding things out. What did you have a sort of an epiphany moment where you decided that this was what you had to do, or have you always been predisposed, shall we say, to wanting to know the truth? What kicked you into gear?
I think it's maybe a combination of both of those scenarios you describe. I mean, I think on one hand, I've always been skeptical of power and of government. I grew up, a young punk and into the metal scene. So listening to a lot of bands that, at least on the surface, had a rebellious message. And so I think I kind of had that, not any sort of deeper philosophical understanding, but just like, yeah, screw the government, I don't trust power or whatever. And that turned into being a rebellious teenager and, on and on from there. But really, I think what did it for me was that I ended up getting arrested at 20 years old. I got that rebellious teenager turned into, getting into more and more trouble. The older I got, I was battling with a lot of depression and things like that. And I didn't really have the proper tools to deal with it. So after I graduated high school and went into college, I started drinking, started using drugs, and very quickly within 2 years was locked up. And it was that experience of getting locked up and facing a year behind bars. And I ended up doing 19 months in Texas in the US behind bars. The first year was obviously a big life shift for me because I found myself in that situation. And I really chose to use that time to try to understand why I was there, why I was trying to escape using drugs, what it was that was the root cause of that, especially because I come from a family of drug addicts and alcoholics. So I grew up visiting my father in prison for his drug addiction. And when I found myself turning 21 behind bars, it was very much like a real kick in the chest of like, all right, you can go this path and you know what that looks like, or we can try to figure this out and do something different. So that happened in 2005. I got out October 2008. And then about a year after I got out, I was now a felon in the States. So I'm, having difficulty getting jobs, certain places, getting rented, certain places, having that whole experience. And I would spend a lot of time at the library just applying for jobs and really trying to change my life. Because in that process of being locked up, I did start, opening up a little bit spiritually, you could say, getting into meditation and doing some of this inner healing work. So when I got out, I was very much in a place of being sober off the drugs, I rediscovered my own mind, my own intelligence, and had this curiosity at the same time as, navigating being a felon. So I just started checking out books. And then, that all led to just, I think, me rediscovering some of that anti-authority I had in me. And 2009, I watched an Alex Jones documentary. I read the book Rule by Secrecy. I discovered Ron Paul in the US and some of his works, Revolution and Manifesto. And all of these things just kind of coalesced in 1 week. And after that, like everything, I've been on this path since then, since 2009, 2010. And obviously it's evolved since then. But that was really kind of, I think, my own instincts to not trust government, but then going through this deeply intense and kind of traumatic experience combined with, the time in the world, it all just worked out to be.
Yeah. So I'm
the beginning of my journey.
Being in jail or being locked up must have, shall we say, influenced your concept of freedom in a very significant way that perhaps most of us don't experience. But it's interesting because a lot of sort of newbies, as we might call them, they struggle with the idea that there could be a network of control, a global cabal. They struggle. You mentioned a suspicion of government, and I share that as well. Or have shared that for longer than I can remember, but a lot of people don't have that. That's interesting. So you say on the Conscious Resistance Network website, your motto is to do with leading by example and helping others to achieve their freedom. So what do you mean by freedom in that sense, Derrick? Do you mean the sort of broadest sense? Do you mean political freedom? obviously there may be other issues tied in with your concept of freedom, given your experience being locked up.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that, because whenever you're behind bars, people refer to this world, the everyday world that we are mostly existing in, as the free world. So when you're behind bars, it's like, oh, I can't wait to get to the free world. And then, of course, you get out and start to dig a little deeper and realize that maybe it's not as free as you had thought. So yeah, in terms of what I try to do with the conscious resistance and that phrase, that motto there, it really is, I think, a more expansive view of freedom than just political freedom. Obviously that's one level of freedom in the physical realm. Like, even the reason I call my work and my book series The Conscious Resistance, it was largely born out of those experiences that I was describing, of getting locked up, having to face my trauma, kind of having a spiritual awakening, if you will, first, before I started to wake up to conspiracies and, the deeper control systems later on. But for the first couple of years of my life, I kind of lived a double life, where I had my activist friends who were doing marches and rallies and passing out flyers and protests and all that sort of thing. And then I had friends that I met after I got out of being locked up, and we went to meditations, or just consciousness exploration, just whatever. We were kind of exploring that realm of things. But for the first couple of years, I had these dual lives, because it seemed like all of my activist friends at that time were very much logical, rational thinkers, which is a good thing in one sense, I think. But because of that, they were like, oh, what are you talking about? Meditation? What are you, a hippie? Get out of here with that. And then when I'd go to my spiritual friends and I'd tell them, like, oh my God, there's this injustice the government's doing this week. Or have you heard about, geoengineering, or whatever issue I might've been on at the time? They would say things like, don't talk about it. You're going to manifest it. Only good vibes here. And it was kind of that was like their spirituality. And eventually in 2013, I realized that I couldn't separate these things anymore. And that's when I first came up with the idea of this name, The Conscious Resistance, and started launching the website and everything. And for me, that's just the realization, the understanding that the struggle for a more free, ethical, and just world is not only going to come from confronting physical institutions of power, be that government, corporations, NGOs, secret societies, et cetera. That's obviously a piece of the puzzle, but it's not only going to come from that. And it's equally not going to come from just focusing on the spiritual world. But I do think that the two of these things together, especially in the internal, psychological, emotional side of things, I often refer to it as your internal tyrant, your own doubts, fears, insecurities, and limiting beliefs, which can really hold you back and prevent you from being the best version of yourself. And so bringing those two things together, the message of the conscious resistance and what I try to focus on is exploring both of those realms. Obviously, as a journalist, I spend a lot of time doing research onto the physical manifestations of power and trying to expose that. But then in my books and in my talks, I try to focus more on the philosophical side of things, the more internal, spiritual side of things, of like what roles we are playing in our own enslavement. So it really is an exploration of freedom, I think, in the fullest, like most holistic sense, you could say.
Yeah. Do you see the whole issue of the conscious resistance, trying to achieve human freedom and live our best lives? Do you see it as a sort of a battle of ideas? Because there's a lot. Your work in the Pyramid of Power docuseries, particularly, you've uncovered a lot of information, and almost all of the key areas of deception, and they're all essentially, it's all seems to me to be to do with ideas. Do you see it that way, or you have a different way of seeing it? I mean,
No, I definitely think that. In fact, it's interesting you bring this up, because so I have a bad habit that I'm getting better at, of arguing with idiots on the internet. You guys might be familiar with this bad habit. And I'm trying to get better at it. But at the same time, the reason I joke about that is, my partner Miriam will see me maybe stressed out or just putting too much energy into that. And I think there is a certain point where you're just wasting time. Nothing's being gained. But the reason I even bother with these online discussions, not only just responses to my own work, but to get out there into the, digital space and try to combat other bad ideas, is because of what you said. It absolutely is a battle of ideas. And that's why I give it that much weight. I see it as like, if myself and yourself and others who are out there trying to put better ideas, voluntarism, and so forth into people's minds, if we're not there, then the only other ideas that are going to float to the top will be ideas about, how to enslave humanity, various levels of that enslavement. And I do see it that way, very much so, that if I take it upon myself, I'll say, and each person, it's up to you to decide how you handle that. But I do feel like, okay, I've been, this is the life that I've carved for myself. I've been doing this for 15 years. I seem to have a reasonable way of communicating ideas, and whether that's public speaking or writing, et cetera. So I'm going to use that platform and that opportunity and that ability to the best I can to try to combat other ideas that I think really are to the detriment of humanity.
Yeah. So is your ultimate goal, that we should all live in a free world and, human flourishment? Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously that looks different person to person, but broadly speaking, yeah. I mean, I want each individual, like I like to sometimes say that what I'm after is individual liberty or personal liberty for collective liberation. I definitely think that we have to start with the individual and not subvert the individual to the will of the collective. But I am ultimately, I would, as silly or naive as it might sound, then I will say I'm less optimistic about this happening in my lifetime than I may have been in my younger years. Aimed at collective liberation, and that has to start with the individual. The individual has to find their own path. They have to claim their own sovereignty, and then the more of us, this is kind of goes back to leading by example, right? Like if I can be an example, if you can be an example of a shining human being who is stepping in their power and is living as free as possible, I've seen it in my own life that this inspires other people to take actions. It might not be the same actions that you or I take, but they find the way that fits their life and their interests and their goals. And it encourages them to just take that next step. And I really think that's what this is ultimately about, is like the way we free humanity is by putting forth, this is kind of the core tenet of voluntarism as well, is like you put forth an example of one human being that is striving in that direction. And the more of us who are just putting forth that example and taking inspiration from each other, before you know it, you look around and there's a lot of free people.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Sounds great. Yeah, it's interesting that your optimism is tempered. I was going to ask you that a little bit later on, but we'll come back to that because in some respects, one of your earliest episodes in the Pyramid of Power is to do with education and how that's been co-opted, hijacked, or taken over really by the powers that shouldn't be. Do you think that part of our challenge, us thought leaders, truth seekers, trying to infuse and encourage and inspire people, do you think one of the problems is that the effects of the controlled educational system have sort of they've come to pass. It's borne fruit. The way that education has been sort of turned into a sausage machine and the sort of Prussian model and all that sort of thing. Do you think that we're now sort of we find that good thinking people are sort of thin on the ground? Is that your experience?
I would say that's probably a great summation of it. You mentioned the Prussian system, and this has been in the United States, the Western world. It's pretty much been adopted all around the world, and that's been we're 150 years, 200 years into this experiment of that sort of education. Um, and I think you're right that now we're sort of seeing the outcomes of that, the fruit of that. And then at the same time, I also find it interesting that I did go through 12 years of the indoctrination, and I know a lot of people who are out now doing great work who also went through that indoctrination. So obviously, it doesn't completely work, And I've actually, this is like a whole different topic, but it brings me to a question that I've been trying to figure out for years of like, what is it? Is there some sort of magic bullet that awakens a human being? But I don't really know that there is, because of all the people I've met over the last 15 years. You got people who like, oh no, I used to drink fluoride all the time. I watched a bunch of TV. I went through 12 years of education plus 8 years of college indoctrination. And it, no matter what the person goes through, at some point, maybe the key ingredient is some sort of trauma or kind of like life shifting event, because I went to prison. I've met people who said, I got sick, I was facing cancer, and that caused me to go on this research, go down the rabbit holes. Something tends to happen, it seems like, that will sort of trigger this questioning spirit and some of our brothers and sisters out there. But obviously that doesn't pertain to everybody. So I do find it interesting. I think that we are seeing the results of this indoctrination system, and we see it all around us, how there is a lack of critical thinkers, a lack of skepticism. And then at the same time, like I said, it's not absolute, right? There clearly are people who can still go through those systems, find their ways out. And I don't know if that's just some of us have a naturally curious instinct. And so we're a sort of personality type or a genetic type that's going to be more prone to question, and others are more prone to be submissive. I don't know, but I would imagine if there is some sort of metric like that, that the powers that shouldn't be, as you said, probably are very aware of it.
Yeah, I'm sure they've had their research teams on that one. But it is interesting, isn't it? Because to some extent, the human spirit does really seem to be indomitable when certain factors come to pass. So when people are really switched on, committed, and as you say, the sort of mystical sort of mixture of circumstance, this was unknown, should I say, mixture of ingredients comes together, and that is encouraging, isn't it? So, in your work on the conscious agora, Derek, you mention early on in that work, of course, your triangle of the key three principles, or the three key principles, I should say, with individualism, permagora, and mindfulness. Can you share with us perhaps your understanding of individualism and that its role in the whole scheme of things, not only the conscious agora, but maybe the bigger picture of your broader goals of achieving human freedom?
Absolutely. So, what you're referring to is the Conscious Agora is the name of an eco village that I'm building here in Mexico. Originally, though, it was just a theoretical idea that I had kind of hoped would come to reality, and I'm happy to say it's in that process. This originally comes from the third book of the Conscious Resistance trilogy, which is called Manifesto of the Free Humans. And of the three books in that series, it's the most practical, where I tried to, me and my co-writer, John Vibes, tried to really think about what would, if we were going to create our ideal world, a stateless society where people are living in line with the non-aggression principle and voluntarism, et cetera, how would we approach property? How would we approach various topics? And then that final section is, here's what an ideal community in that world might look like. And as you said, there's sort of three main cornerstones of that. Individualism, I think I call it in the book, sovereignty of the individual, which is another way to say voluntarism, mindfulness, and then permagora, which is the combination of permaculture and the agorist counter-economic ideology. So when it comes to individualism in this sense, like I was pointing to earlier about my belief in having empowered individuals in order to have collective liberation, that we shouldn't fall prey to the collectivist ideology that says that the so-called group is more important than the individual, so we must run over individual liberties and freedoms in order to achieve some collective goal. I wholeheartedly reject that idea. And when I was doing some research for this book, I spent a bit of time nerding out on like anarchist history, American anarchist history, and really some of the people who were inspiring the modern libertarian and voluntarist movement. And one of those men is Josiah Warren. He lived in New York State and upstate New York in the late 1800s. And he had a lot of really interesting ideas, some of which I think maybe aren't as sound as they may have been for him at that time. But overall, he did believe in what he called the sovereignty of the individual, which I think, again, we would probably just call it the non-aggression principle now. But it was this idea that we're very familiar with, that the individual should be sovereign over their own self and their own affairs. And then not only that, like, do you claim that for yourself, but that you extend that to every single other sovereign being out there. And obviously that has some profound implications for how society can run if we could all just find that basic understanding. And one of the reasons I really included that, besides just I really like the phrasing of that sovereignty of the individual, but he actually started several communities. The names are escaping me right now. It's been a few years since I've read into his histories, but he kept detailed journals on these communities. And actually, for a period of time when these existed in the US, like they basically went and bought a bunch of land, homesteaded, and all these people started to move into his community. And they had like a community shop. Every home had like a garden with it. They had no police in there. They had, no political parties. And there was kind of just like their own little sanctuary. And it lasted for a good couple of years. And so it's really interesting. He has detailed journals on everything that happened there, including him sort of trying to practice his own economic model. And it's just a really cool part of American history that not too many people know about and is now essentially forgotten. But I took a lot of inspiration from sort of the vision that he laid out, and that did form the cornerstone for the community that we're trying to build. And yeah, as far as like the broader world, again, back to trying to live by example, I tend to operate in this way with whatever form of activism or philosophy that I'm doing. Like, you're not going to see me give a speech or write a book about something that I've never practiced myself. And I think that's important. In fact, one of my other big inspirations, Samuel Konkin, who is the founder of Agorism, this kind of idea of building parallel systems and the counter economy, the parallel economy. He has a really cool quote where he says something to the effect that you're not going to be very convincing if you're not practicing these things. So if people hear you espouse these ideas, but then they look and they see that you're not even living this, well, then good luck convincing people to, follow your path that you're allegedly promoting, right? So I really take that to heart. So everything that I have written about and discussed are things that I strive to achieve. Obviously, we live in an imperfect world and we have to navigate that to the best we can. But yeah, I really tried to live that way. And so it went from being a theoretical idea that we've talked about in a book back in 2017 to now something that we're building in Mexico. We bought this land in 2023. We just paid it off a couple of months ago in January.
But before we get into that, Derek, forgive me for interrupting, but just
fine.
to do with Josiah Warren, do you think that, back in his time, what's the word you use? There's lots of words, aren't they? The cabal, the powers that shouldn't be, the sort of parasite class. I can't remember your phraseology, but
predator class is one of them. Yeah.
Do you think that they were alive and kicking back then, and would they, do you think, given the what we know about their agenda and their desire to sort of control humanity and to parasite off the productive people, do you think he would have had some stick, really? And do you think his community would have ultimately, you mentioned that we don't really hear anything about him anymore, which is, you've inspired me to sort of dig in and find out a bit more about what he was saying with those journals. But I can't help suspecting from my full context of knowledge, which I'm sure is similar to yours. Do you suspect that the powers that would have been against him back then, in some shape or form?
Absolutely. And it's interesting you say that too, because obviously I've been aware of these agendas since the beginning of my work. My work started out more conspiratorial and then got into voluntarism and kind of anarchism. So I tend to have these kind of patches of my life where I'm focused on one specific thing. Like right now, I'm doing deep dives into secret societies and everything as I finish the Pyramid of Power. So when I was studying this anarchist history, and not just American anarchist history, but I was trying to understand how it fit into the broader, like, radical movements, the socialists, the Marxists, et cetera, people that I wouldn't necessarily agree with, but how does it fit into the context of all these movements? I wasn't looking at it with the lens that you're describing now, but I imagine if I was to go back, and I have Josiah Warren's books here, and kind of look at it through that lens, because that time frame, absolutely, the secret societies were operating within the United States, Freemasons and others that were already here in the United States. Pretty much from the founding of the United States. And depending on, the theories people might believe about the Bavarian Illuminati, there are definitely people who are warning George Washington while he was president, that these groups were making their way to the Americas following the French Revolution, and were trying to start infiltrating, churches and Freemason lodges and things of that sort.
So George Washington a Freemason as well?
Yeah, so actually, it's funny that you bring this up, because actually this is the section I've just wrapped up on the Pyramid of Power. And so I make a note in there that he was a Freemason. We have like a documentation of that. But then at the same time, in these letters that I'm discussing, so there's a book, I just put it up somewhere. It's called Proofs of a Conspiracy. And it was written in the late 1700s by a Scottish monk, John Robison, or actually he was a scientist, John Robison. And he was warning all about the things I just described. Well, that book started to get pretty popular, and a gentleman named George Snyder, we actually have the records of Washington's letters, all of his correspondence, and you can see this letter where him and George Snyder go back and forth, and George Snyder sent Washington this book. Washington replies a couple weeks later saying, "So I'm so busy, I haven't had time to read it." And they just correspond back and forth. And in that letter, in one of those letters, George Washington says that he is very aware that there is, he's like, I have no doubt that this presence is infiltrating the Americas. He said, but he actually corrects George Snyder and says, you're actually incorrect. I haven't been in a Freemason lodge in the last 30 years, and I probably only went once or twice. So it seems unclear. Like, I think he probably, maybe he got an honorary degree or something, but if he did, it seems by the later stages of his life, he was definitely kind of questioning that. And again, even that, like it's not to derail us from where we're already at, but it's definitely a more complex history than I think some folks in our broader conspiracy community like to make it out to be. There was Freemasons fighting on both sides of the war, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution. So, the influence is there, but I think it is more complex than that. But nevertheless, I do think those forces were active. And imagine if Josiah Warren's community had, for all we know, it could have been some conspiracy behind why it failed and why it kind of fell apart. I didn't see any evidence of that. Of course, I wasn't looking when I was researching prior, but I wouldn't be surprised if his community did survive and continued to grow. And again, was an example to other communities. If that model started to be replicated,
because that's the
then you could
danger, isn't
imagine
it? That there is a well-known danger for those who want control, the danger of a good
exactly.
example, and good examples can't be allowed because, of course,
Exactly. I imagine they would have came and shut him down eventually if he was growing too big and getting too influential and expiring more communities like this.
Yeah, and the other thing that intrigues me is with people like George Washington and so forth, and we look back and we read what people say and what they allegedly believe, but sometimes I kind of think that we have to be like almost a little bit suspicious, because it occurs to me that people might want to appear to be thinking something where in actual fact they want you to think that they think that. Are you with me? Without getting too
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes there is some 3D, 4D chess going on, right? And not in the way that maybe some people think it is. But yeah, I definitely agree with you. I
and
was actually
it's
thinking
part of the
about
whole
this morning.
propaganda thing, isn't it? Sorry to interrupt you there.
No, just because something's written down, and I was just reflecting on this as I was doing my research before we jumped on here, that I have a lot of historical resources and references that I include in this final episode, but throughout the series. And it's not intended to say, hey, here's something written in an old book that means it's true. Like, that doesn't inherently mean it's true. You got to follow sources, and like you said, you need to follow your own instincts and remain skeptical. I think it's a good position to have a natural skepticism towards authority and power. Like, that's probably should be our standard, mode that we operate in. So just because it's in an old book, just because George Washington said this, it doesn't mean that is the exact truth and there's nothing else there. Often we find things are a bit more complex.
Yeah, and I guess it's been fascinating following your series, The Pyramid of Power, and I'm looking forward to seeing the last one. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because all of these secret societies, and we kind of know that only evil benefits from secrecy. I mean, virtue gains nothing from concealing itself. So it makes me wonder whether, again, all these different, there's a whole network of secret societies, isn't there? And it must have been exhausting for you, exhaustive work, sort of, finding out about them all and researching them all. But do you, again, coming back to that ideas thing, I mean, are they all just expressions of particular ideas? For example, the idea of manipulating people and living off their backs as in a parasite way, controlling people to exploit them, extract values from them, expropriate their wealth. Do you think they're possibly all just various manifestations, locally, wherever they are, of the same practice, which is basically exploit fellow human beings because it's easier than doing things yourself?
I definitely think that in many ways that these different groups and secret societies and fraternities, et cetera, and then obviously just public governments, and other entities that are not even very much hidden, that there does seem to be some strain of ideology. Maybe they wouldn't label it the same, but essentially it comes down to control, domination, and as you said, being parasitic in that process. And these all could be the same expressions of something. I do think, not to give away my ending of the Pyramid of Power, but I do think there is a spiritual component. The Christian truthers filter it through the lens of it's Satan, the devil versus Christianity, et cetera. I don't necessarily take that stance, but I do think that there is a battle of good versus evil, if we can, be so reductionist to that. But I do think, like you said, it's an expression that shows up in different ways. And that might be one way where people are willing to lie, they're willing to steal, they're willing to manipulate, they're willing to, be a parasite and to just crash markets or whatever it may be, commit false flags, et cetera, if it furthers their goals. And even within these different secret societies and people with all their theories of who's at the top, and if there is a hierarchy, who's the final bad boss there, I think that those groups, even with their own different expressions, because this is a worldwide agenda, so you have people who are part of this agenda from different countries which have completely different cultures. And I don't think they're all aligned on every single answer, every single moment of every single day or anything like that. But are they aligned more often than not with each other than they would be against the people, the useful idiots, the masses, the dregs of society as they see us? Absolutely. They're going to partner together
On the
to
broad
further
brush,
their
yeah.
aims and do whatever it is that they need to do to move the ball forward, move the agenda forward. And that doesn't mean that there might not be, because I'm super skeptical, like when I see things in the media about some saber rattling between Russia and China or the US. And I'm always very curious about how much of that is real and how much of that is a public show. Again, not to say that they're aligned on everything and there won't be any real conflicts and that everything is completely fake or staged. But I do think in the bigger, broader picture, they're going to work together. They're going to align together if that means furthering their goals of creating, this
Absolutely.
this new international order.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, I suppose it's worth reminding ourselves that the ideology of collectivism, which is what Klaus Schwab reminded us all or told us all explicitly, is on the agenda for us all by 2030, he said a few years ago, when we'll all own nothing and be happy about it. This is collectivism he's describing. The essential ideological bedfellows there are Russia, China, the communist states, and bearing in mind what you just said there, the sort of chess game, when they get this and that. But ultimately, lots of things could be at play, I suppose. But ultimately, the USA, America, does stand as the only real country that was ever born in freedom. And has a cultural sort of core, if there's anything much left of it, of people who really do kind of just sort of intuitively, implicitly carry that torch for freedom. And from a global perspective, that needs to be snuffed out. I mean, that isn't a problem in China because people have never known freedom in China, and it probably isn't much of a problem in Russia. So it seems to me in this sort of global chess game, I don't know what you think about this, but ultimately America needs to be brought down, doesn't it? Because that's where
I
the
agree.
focus of resistance to the global collectivist state is. Do you agree with that? Any of that?
Yeah, and so a couple of thoughts here. I do think that the U.S. Clearly plays an important role. I mean, there's a reason why I grew up in the United States, and as I travel and visit the world, it is sometimes surprising, but then ultimately not too surprising to find how many people are paying attention to U.S. politics, how many people outside of the U.S., especially in the confused freedom movements around the world, are falling or clamoring for a Trump-like figure in their own countries. I've seen this in Australia, in the UK, Germany, elsewhere, where people kind of cheer on the things that Trump does and see it as something that's good for them somehow. So there clearly is an influence that the US and US politics has. I also do think that it's interesting to note that the founding of America itself, we mentioned the Freemason influence there. Again, that doesn't automatically mean it was a control from the beginning, but I do think there's some reasonable questions to be asked there. One of the things I've been reflecting on is a lot of the truth movements, freedom movements around the US, particularly, I'll speak from my own experience here, have been filtered through a Christian worldview. And so a lot of the community, it does come from that perspective. And so they have a knee-jerk reaction to things like the Freemason, the Illuminati, which obviously I also have skepticism and concerns about. But the more and more I dig into their writing, I just think it becomes more complex than people might want it to be. This is not an advocation or a support of those societies, but it does seem at some level the initial impetus was to bring this illuminated ideology, which was Enlightenment philosophy, which I think much of which we would agree with, freedom of speech, self-ownership. These were new ideas that, hey, maybe we don't need to be ruled by a monarch. Maybe we don't need to be ruled by the church, right? So there was a rejection of that, and many of those ideas played into the founding of the United States. And so there was this Freemason, even Illuminati influence in that way. Now, from the Christian perspective, the idea of teaching people that the church is bad, that people own themselves, some people reject that because they see that as being anti-religious. And the more I'm reading these old articles and these old essays between Freemasons and the Jesuits and the Catholic Church, the Vatican, there was definitely a fear that these ideas were spreading so far and wide that they were turning people away from God. And for myself, as a person who's not particularly religious, and in fact did grow up in a religious home and has plenty of issues with the way these institutions can be used to manipulate people, um, I don't inherently think it's a problem to sort of take people away from the age of the monarchs. Now, of course, the other extreme end is that you end up with things like the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, and them wanting to completely abolish religion and burn churches and kill pastors and priests. It wasn't about like, let's liberate the people and let them make their own choices, like you and I might say. It was more like, let's abolish all religion altogether. Let's, and in some cases, let's put atheism or this sort of put reason as the new God. I wouldn't support or advocate that, but I do find it interesting that much of the original ideas of Freemasonry in these secret conspiracy meetings they were having were trying to promote Enlightenment philosophy, much of which ended up later on contributing to libertarianism and voluntarism. And that gets into a whole nother world of conspiracies where some people say, well, those ideas, libertarianism and anarchism and voluntarism, those are psyops themselves. And those were seeded by the Illuminati to turn people away from the idea that, man needs government. So, there's a lot of threads there to pull, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, another thing that people tend to forget, as you said earlier, when they're calling for a sort of a Trump-like leader, is that I think a lot of people tend to forget that we saw an illustration through the COVID period that, with Operation Lockstep, we saw a very clear, concrete example of just how closely knit together all of the world's governments are. And I think people forget that it is some kind of chess game, and they seem to often, you talk to people, and people have varying degrees of knowledge, of course, but you talk to some people, and they seem to be coming from a premise where they really think that this country's independent and that country's independent, whereas obviously I think we're probably in agreement that no countries are independent. They're all following some kind of script. Or broadly speaking, certainly they're within a set of tram lines. Obviously, would you agree with that? Do you think that's a sort of a naive approach to think and factor that into your reasoning when you're trying to predict what's going to happen? To think that there's actually an individual play going on here, as opposed to a show that's being orchestrated.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the powers that shouldn't be, which we can say, and I feel confidently to say have been around for at least 100 years, and we could probably say centuries, and some would go even further, but I could say confidently documented the last 100 years for sure. Various groups manipulating world governments, manipulating wars, manipulating financial events, etc. There, like you said, there is a sort of prescribed parameters which you can move within, and even when we see these public things like, okay, Trump's talking crap with the WEF or whatever, I still find myself very skeptical, because I think that you have to understand that these groups, including the groups that I just mentioned, the Freemasons, Illuminati, etc., absolutely understand revolution and counter-revolution as well. They understand controlling movements and controlling the opposition. So I don't think that's not to say, again, because I don't want to be sending home a disempowering message, but a realistic message. These groups are highly organized. This is where they out-organize us 10-1, and they have been for generations now. That doesn't mean they control everything. They can't control what you do when you wake up and how you feel when you go to sleep at night and what you do in between those hours. But they absolutely have the power and the ability to shape world events. And of course, those impact and affect you.
Absolutely. So coming back to your conscious Agora, where are you at there? So you've mentioned that individualism is key, and you're setting up your community in Mexico. I think most of my listeners are probably familiar enough with you to know that you've got some land now and all that good stuff. Pick up the thread maybe that I interrupted you from earlier, in terms of your goal to help assist people towards freedom and human flourishment. So you're setting up the Conscious Agora in Mexico, and you're leading by example, and presumably, maybe you can fill us in here. I mean, this is like a microcosmic example of what humanity could be doing if we lived a different way, free of all the controls and the economic exploitation, living a different way more broadly. Can you sort of catch us up on your intentions around that, and where you're at in that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, you're correct. It's definitely just another example for myself and for the people who are involved in this to try to be an example for others of a different path, a different way to live. Obviously, we're not the first people to think of let's go back to the land. I described Josiah Warren and sort of the early homestead movements in the Americas as America was being developed, and then you had the 50s and 60s, 70s, another sort of wave of back to the land movements and things of that sort. So it's not unique in that sense. What I think makes us unique from any other community that I've visited, and I've visited quite a few over the last decade as I've been kind of on this path and knew that this was eventually going to be where I was headed. That's in the US, UK, Denmark, Costa Rica, Mexico, elsewhere, is this specific focus on voluntarism and on individual liberty. A lot of times I noticed in the permaculture world, in the homesteading, eco-village, intentional community space, people's politics tend to be more left-leaning or progressive, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I do think it's more in that collective mindset that we were discussing earlier, right? So people hear that you're going to, I see this online. If I mention I'm going to move to the land and live in an eco village with people, they like to refer to it as a commune, or they assume that we're all like sharing resources, or we don't own anything, or just these different concepts, their own sort of assumptions about it. And I think that's because that's largely what has been seen by these type of movements. But we are striving to provide an example that balances that individualism, that the individual liberty with the benefits of community. So as an example of that, the land is 23 acres. There's already fruit trees there, bananas, avocados, limes, pears, pomegranates, lots of beautiful stuff that's been growing there. And that was prior, before we got the land, had already been done. And we are making a situation where all the individuals who are buying in, which we're aiming for 8 to 10 households, at least in this beginning, maybe in the future more, but 8 to 10 households, some individuals, some couples, some kids, things of that sort. Each household owns their own plot of land on that 23 acres. So you own, let's say, 0.25 acres of yourself to do what you want and build and have your homestead on. But at the same time, and you have a claim to that. We have, I'll say, lawful paperwork to back up that claim. And the rest of it is sort of like we all choose to steward the land. So in addition to having your private plot of land that is yours to do what you want, eat what you want in your house, build the home how you want, we're all aiming for natural building, but we have some fluidity within that. Yeah. Maybe that's cob for some people, maybe that's adobe, maybe it's hempcrete, whatever. But then we all get to enjoy the benefits of the water that is on. We have a nice, beautiful stream that we can swim in. There's 2 springs of water coming out of the ground that we're going to be using. There's a pond there. There's all the fruit trees I mentioned. So nobody has a single claim to ownership over those fruit trees. It's sort of, those are sort of held in common, you could say. Okay. So we're really trying to balance those ideas. Of land?
Sorry to interrupt you there, Derrick, but are they on a separate parcel of land from where the different lots are where people will live?
Exactly. So I'll give you a little more about that. Like when we were first approaching this property, when we decided we wanted to build in this property, we kind of approached it of like, all right, let's walk the land and let's try to identify as many home sites that seem reasonable. And so, as we're walking around, someone's like, oh, I want to build my house right there. And that's in the avocado orchard or something like that, right? And then that brought up questions in our discussion of like, so does that mean he now owns those avocados and he cuts off access to the rest of us? And ultimately, we decided we didn't want to go that route. We thought it would end up being messier than needed. So instead, we have kind of concentrated our village in 2 or 3 different areas, which are really the flattest areas of the land. We have like a lot of beautiful slopes, and those already are covered in fruit orchards and things of that sort. And there will be a few other slopes we might build on. But for the most part, we're kind of concentrating the village of the people who are going to live there in these different areas. And that is separate from the fruit orchards. So yeah, you have your own private home there. We're in a little village together, pathways, garden, etc. We're also going to be building what we call the Holistic Education Center. And again, this is part of the effort to bring people here to host events, and not just super expensive events that only a certain kind of person could afford to fly to because, they want a nice retreat. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But we also very much see this land and this opportunity as kind of like a freedom boot camp, if you will, a people's reset boot camp, if you will. In fact, our first event that we're more than likely going to hold is probably going to be in January, February 2026, after the next People's Reset in Mexico, because we'll have the main public event, hundreds of people, 5 days and all that. But then we want to do a bit more intimate for maybe 3 days for those who want to go deeper into these ideas. And this would maybe be at most 15, 20 people, and bring them to the land, house them for a few days, feed them. And we do workshops on like freedom cells organizing, workshops on like the real law, like some of the ideas that you get into. We could do some permaculture builds and really try to bring all these different skill sets that we're trying to promote, and bring in people who want to learn, but then I think most importantly are going to take the ideas back to their own local community and continue to spread those ideas elsewhere. Because the broader picture of the Conscious Agora that I always imagined was that this would really be a network of communities that are networked around the world, not just in Mexico, not just in the US, but all around the world, who are united by principles, right?
Yes.
So they're going to look different in their own expressions. But imagine if we could say, like, here's this network of communities that we all know value individual liberty, voluntarism, sovereignty of the individual, that's above everything else. They're also aiming to use permaculture, syntropic agroforestry in general, trying to work with the environment, not sort of in the kind of climate change propaganda way, but just trying to take care of the planet. And then also for us, that third component, which is just broadly termed mindfulness, for us, that really signifies, especially in our specific community, but I think in the broader network idea too, wanting to collaborate and work with people who have a certain level of emotional intelligence and emotional maturity, who are trying to continue to evolve as people. We don't have any sort of must meditate 10 hours a week kind of like requirement or anything like that. It's not that. It's just simply saying that we do want to strive towards using tools like nonviolent communication. We're going to be organizing our community using sociocracy, which I think is a really interesting way of decision making and bringing communities together that is non-coercive, is not necessarily hierarchical, and it's not collective either. It's not like consensus where you have to talk for hours and hours and hours until everybody finally agrees on everything. It's a little bit different, right? So we're trying to bring in all those components, like people who are mindful, continuing and wanting to evolve and grow as human beings and not be static, people who are interested in natural building and permaculture and sort of, quote unquote, alternative ecological solutions, as well as maintaining that sovereignty of the individual as the sort of prime stone. And then from there, we have a few other principles that as we've got into, our own specifics for our community. Like we want to do natural building. We're in Mexico. We want to be very integrated. So we're looking for people who have some level of Spanish proficiency. We're not building a gated community where we never speak to the locals, and kind of, because I'm not originally from Mexico. My family is 3 or 4 generations back. My partner Miriam was born in the US, but her family's from Mexico. So we have some connection here, but obviously a lot of people are coming from elsewhere, Canada, the States. But we wanted to make it clear to people, this is not an expat bubble we're trying to live in where we just are totally disconnected. In fact, because of our land, it's a very much a necessity for us to be integrated and connected, because we're out in a mountain about an hour and a half outside the city, where it's not like there's a grocery store or anything like that. We're living in the mountain with 2 neighbors who are born and raised in the mountains, and they know that land better than us. So they have kind of become integrated to our community. They're working with us. And so there's other sort of supplemental principles that are a part of that. But those 3 foundational principles are what we're trying to build from, and see how many other people around the world can we unite around those ideas.
Yeah. I think it's great that you're recognizing the need for private property, because I think that's the reason why a lot of the communities, the community experiments have come and gone. I can remember when I was a teenager, way back, a lot of us talking about living in community then, and you hear about various people who tried, and it always seems to fall apart, with various sort of squabbles. And I mean, my personal take on it is that some kind of private ownership, this is my bit. I'm here. I'm sovereign over this small bit, and then you voluntarily interact with everybody else, and of course division of labour, and you share and the advantages of community. But it seems to me that that absence of private ownership in the sort of commune or sort of socialist influenced model of community, I suspect that's a key part of the fact I haven't endured, and I take my hat off to you for at least acknowledging that. I mean, it's obviously difficult to design a community, isn't it? To design any kind of way of living where you're naturally, in association with other people. But as you mentioned earlier, doing so according to principles gives you a lot of latitude for individual expression and different ways of doing things, provided you're,
Absolutely. Could I just say something about that really
please,
briefly?
yeah,
So I want to just emphasize to anybody who's hearing this and is, interested in pursuing your own community, or just, has interest in this thought, the importance of principles cannot be understated. I mean, I've learned from a lot of really, really intelligent people. And as I mentioned, we've visited a lot of communities. Some of these interviews are on my website at The Conscious Resistance. We got to go visit the oldest intentional community in Mexico. Actually, they've been around for probably about 45 years now, going on 45 years. And they have a really interesting story of being like traveling circus performers that somehow end up settling down in Mexico from all over the world. And I got to interview one of their founders and just really pick her brain. And I learned so much through these kind of experiences. We go visit communities, we sort of see, oh, cool, they're doing that. We want to adopt that. We're like, oh, okay, they're trying that out. That doesn't really fit with what we want to go for. It's important, I think, to get a taste of what other people do, what this looks like in practice. But because the community that we are building came originally out of a book that I wrote and some principles that I laid down, we kind of have that, constitution, for lack of a better term, to refer
yeah,
back to, right? And the only idea within the broader community, which is now 5 households, and we're bringing in 3 more. We're in the process of vetting them. We took a lot of time, our original group and myself and my partner Miriam, to really, okay, we've got this foundation that I created, but what do we, how do we extrapolate from that? But always referring back to that, right? And so the general idea is the community can evolve and change and grow. Like the intentional community I talked to here in Mexico, they told me that they have changed their decision-making process 4 times over 40 years, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's just an interesting bit of knowledge, because you understand they did one thing for a while that might have worked for a decade. People change, people grow, new members come in. After a while, they realize, all right, this is kind of not helpful anymore. We should find a new way to make decisions. And we've taken that into our process. Now, this doesn't mean that every decision, everybody must consult with each other. Again, what you do in your own home is none of my business, really, as long as you're not violating any of those core principles that we refer back to, right? But there will be times when decisions arise that do impact all of us. Like, hey, do we want to build a fence? Do we want to build a wall, or whatever, right? And so when those decisions come about that affect all of the members of the community, this is when we step into the sociocratic principles and making decisions where we do hear from everybody, but we're not doing a democracy where it's majority rule or anything like that. And so if we get to a point where that process is no longer useful, right now sociocracy feels good for us, but maybe in time we'll realize it's not as effective as we thought. And so we're going to try something else. And I've met some of my permaculture teachers and talked to them, and some of the things that they've said that we've done that they never even considered, we're starting from that foundational principles. I mean, it's kind of it sounds so to me kind of logical and basic, but it's astounding to me to meet other people who've been living in community for 10 years and they still haven't even taken those steps. Like, and now of course they're seeing the problems results, because everybody has a different idea of what freedom means and what does that look like in actual practice. And so I just want to emphasize that, because I met a lot of people, especially during COVID, when people were in panic mode and they were like, oh, I need to get to the land, I need to find a community. People who came to Mexico because Mexico didn't have any of the quarantines or vaccine requirements or any of that stuff, and they rushed to get the land, and they started out with the money conversation first, or they didn't spend enough time on what does freedom actually look like to you? What does community even mean to you? And they moved into land with people, and 6 months later they're suing each other, or the lawyers are involved because they didn't take the time. So we've taken what I think might have felt like a slower but steady process since 2020 when we first came to Mexico. But in 5 years, now we've paid off our land. We own, the property. We have members come in. We have our decision-making documents. We have our conflict resolution documents. We have the core principles. And this doesn't mean you can account for every single thing that'll ever happen in the future. But when that inevitable conflict does arise, which just by human nature, it's bound to arise, instead of it resulting in, oh my God, the entire community fell apart because we never thought about how are we going to handle conflicts, we have now systems to refer back to. Doesn't mean they're perfect, doesn't mean we won't adjust them in the future, but at the very least it gives us a template to work with. And I think that's really important. And it's just surprises me how many people who are a bit further ahead than us in terms of building and infrastructure and stuff like that, but who haven't taken what I consider to be those first
yeah.
steps.
Yeah, that's great. It sounds like it's been well thought through, which is always a good foundation. Um, Do you feel any sort of concern? Obviously, you've got your internal things sorted there that you've been describing. Does the sort of long arm of the state concern you? Obviously, Mexico has its advantages politically, but given that, the global agenda that we're all aware of is global and it involves the state, reaching and aiming to control all of our lives, and that's what we're trying to avoid, of course. So, how concerned are you about, managing to avoid that long arm of the state ultimately reaching you in some shape or negative form?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, awareness of the government and the state and global events right now, especially in terms of the U.S. and Mexico, there's some evolving relationships we can say there. And one being that the U.S. has now designated certain cartels in Mexico as terrorist organizations, and there are absolutely people here, Mexicans and expats, who are wondering, what does that mean? Does that mean the U.S. thinks it now has the freedom to launch drone bombs over here, or kidnap people in the middle of the night? Like, these are realistic concerns, even outside of just general concerns of government infringement. And so we're keeping an eye on those developments. I will say that one of the reasons, being originally from Texas, I originally thought I was going to do this idea there. It just didn't end up working out. And really, it was a choice that as Miriam and I started to visit Mexico, she got to visit some of her family, and we traveled about. We really fell in love with the country. I mean, obviously, it's not a perfect place. There are issues with cartels in some part of the country that are realistic concerns. Thankfully, we haven't had to face any of those sort of things, but we're not being naive, and we're not being ignorant and acting like those things don't exist. And even in a place like Mexico, gun ownership does exist. Gun rights do exist. They're a little bit more limited than the U.S. But we do believe in self-defense, and that's all I'll say on that. That our community absolutely does recognize that right,
Mm-hmm.
and plans to practice that right if and when necessary. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to be able to defend against the surveillance state with satellites, or all the drones, as I mentioned, or things like that. And I think we could both sit here and spend the rest of the podcast dreaming up any number of negative scenarios of what ifs. And believe me, I've heard a lot of this from people who are very critical of my efforts and say, oh, you think they're going to let you just grow your own food? You think they're going to let you go be free? Have you heard of Waco? They're just going to come kill you. They're going to come bomb you. And those things are all possibilities. I mean, again, I don't deny that. None of our community is sort of naively thinking that the world is, just going to ignore us forever. But I do believe that Mexico offers certain benefits in terms of being behind the agenda, like the progression of the agenda. Now, in major metropolises like Mexico City, Guadalajara, and some other cities, you definitely see all the same stuff. And during COVID, those places had mask requirements and stuff, but it was done on the local level. It was never the national level. And at the same time, you go to a rural area in the countryside or in the mountainside, and there's people who never even heard of COVID and were never paying any attention to it. And there's people who are just completely living their lives. The government also doesn't have the resources or make the effort to necessarily go out there and keep tabs on what people are doing. We've been told that as far as property taxes go, which are thankfully really low, but that's also something I don't want to accept, and that I hope, and the goal with the bigger movement is that we get to a point where these networked communities are strong enough to eventually say, like, no thanks, we're not, come collect it. We've been told that for them to collect the property taxes, they literally have to go out to the mountain and come to our properties. So we might play that to our advantage for as long as we can.
Yeah.
And I do think, yeah, the agenda is behind in terms of technological development. That just doesn't mean that, like, I'm here in Mexico right now, I'm on the internet, I have all the standard things people would expect. But the further you go outside of the big cityscapes, and this is similar other places, you're less likely to run into these agendas.
Oh, I've lost your sound, Derek.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, it just popped out there.
Okay.
If you can rewind that last sentence.
Yeah. I do think there's a benefit to being outside of the cityscapes and closer to the countryside, and not just in Mexico, but everywhere. I think you recognize this as well, Nigel. And so, yeah, we're keeping an eye of what's going on in the world. But I do want to say that ultimately, if this is what you feel, and anybody hearing this feels like it could be beneficial to your freedom and to your generational freedom, because that's really what I think about, is like the long-term generation, what we're leaving behind. And I'm trying to create a model that can last long into the future, and that somebody coming 20 years after me can take inspiration and then apply it in their own way. If that's something you feel strongly about, then be aware of the potential consequences, but don't let your fear trap you. No matter what sort of doomsday scenario somebody paints, what I usually say to them is like, look, you're right. That could happen. That may happen. It's a what if, right? But so should I do nothing and just sit still and say, okay, well, I'm just going to sit still and let the world get worse instead of trying to live in line with my values? That's not what I'm going to do. For me, what I'll tell them is like, look, let's imagine your scenario is true. Okay. Someday in the future, bad guys come to try to, kill us or take our community away. In the process, I will have spent 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe 30 or 40 years of my life living in line with my values, not talking to government agencies, not dealing with the banking system, growing as much of our food as possible, teaching this to other people. And then sure, if one day and sometime in the future, bad guys come and I have to stand up and defend my liberties and potentially give my life for it, I'd rather do that than sit still because I'm afraid of the consequences.
Yeah.
So for me, it's that important to say, look, let's figure it out. We'll see. We'll meet it when we get there, but I'm not going to just be afraid and be paralyzed by that fear and do nothing.
Yeah, fantastic. Absolutely the best way to go. When people point out, what ifs, I totally agree. I mean, it's just time to tool up, and I don't mean get hold of ammunition. I mean, wise up. I mean, it's time to research how we might fend off that outcome or knowledge up so that we could deal with it. I mean, that to me is the message when someone says, "Oi, this could happen." It's useful. That's one little strand of usefulness that I suppose you could say comes from the sort of the more pessimistic view. So zooming right out, you mentioned the phrase long term there a moment ago, which I think is absolutely crucial as well. I mean, I've been going down a similar route, living outside the matrix. That is my gig. And I'm unfortunately in a situation where I have to keep far more quiet about what I do for obvious reasons. I would relish the idea, you're in arguably a more politically favourable country, and you can afford to be a shining example, which is just marvelous. It really is. It's great to see, Derek, and all power to your elbow. You mentioned earlier that you're not 100% optimistic for a rosy outcome within your lifetime, which resonates with me. I see myself trying to lay the foundations for my children. I've got some young children. I know you've yet to go there, but no doubt in the fullness of time you will. But it is about setting things up that can endure and passing the baton on to the next generation in a very personal sense. So, maybe can you just share a little bit, one or two of your thoughts about
Sure.
the long term, realism versus optimism? And I know nobody wants to send a negative message, least of all me, but we have to modify that with a bit of realism. So, share some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you're correct. I do not have any children right now, but I do have 6 nieces and nephews, and I mean, they really are the driving force of my work, and they have been since they were born, and even and the potential for any future children I may have. And the reason my thinking is framed in generational terms, well, it's two main reasons. One of that being that, as I shared earlier, the more I got into my spiritual journey and started doing a lot of my healing work, I started connecting more to my indigenous roots, my family being native on my mother's side, Seminole Native, and I didn't grow up on the reservation, so I didn't have any direct knowledge of those experiences. It was only later, actually, in my journalistic career and in my spiritual journey, getting to go to Sweat Lodge, getting to go to Sundance, getting to go to some of these ceremonies and learning and being taught about the importance of the 7-generation principle, and for us to think about the impacts that our actions are going to have, not only now on our children and their children and so on, and the people we can actually physically see and will probably meet in our lifetimes, but the people who we're never going to meet, the people who are going to be coming into existence long after we're in the dirt. And of course, I like to extend that both ways as well. I think about the 7 generations of our ancestors who came before us, and no matter where you're at on the planet, what color your skin is, what language you speak, all of our ancestors had to go through blood, sweat, and tears to get us to this point in time, to be alive, to be having these conversations, to be thinking about carrying on this legacy. And so I take that very deeply and very strongly and try to carry that spirit with me everywhere I go. And that's one of the reasons I do think about that. Like, how can I do something? I think this is a hard concept for many of our brothers and sisters out there to imagine, like putting time, energy, and work into something that you're not necessarily going to see the fruits of your labor, because we're, very much, especially in our time now, want instantaneous, reaction, and we want to see things right away, instant gratification. But the causes we're working on, we might not really see the fruits of our labor until we're long and gone. And I think we have to maybe accept that. Doesn't mean we shouldn't work towards solutions in our lifetime, but as you said, laying foundations, setting up systems for the ones coming after us is absolutely important. The other reason I think this is important is because that is what they have been doing. They, as I said earlier, are much more highly organized than those of us on the freedom fighter side, and they think generationally. We've got Henry Kissinger's and David Rockefeller's. These folks have been fallen, dying in the last couple of years, but they died knowing that the systems that they put in place and the agendas they've been working on that they picked up from their forebears will continue on long after they're gone. And I think that is, and it's one of the examples we should take from them, is that they're thinking generationally, and they've got the rest of us thinking about how many likes do I have? What's going on today in the news? What's, trending on Twitter or whatever. So they got people distracted by the day-to-day stuff while they're thinking big picture, long-term. And I think that's something we need to adopt.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, have you any closing thoughts on your the Permagora and anything you'd like to plug, Derrick? Please feel free. And by way of conclusion, if there's anything else that you'd like to add.
Well, first, thanks again for having me on, brother. I appreciate it. And I would love to get you to come down to Mexico next year for the People's Reset, if we can make that happen. I think your message would fit in nicely with what we're doing here. And I was happy to connect with you and have you out for the UK event. And hopefully I'll be out that way again soon. If people are interested in my work, if you want to learn more about the Conscious Agora specifically, we do have a website, super basic website, but it'll lead you to the chapters of what we've been discussing about sovereignty, the individual, Permagora, and this mindfulness piece. You can find that at theconsciousagora.com. My main website for my journalism and for my reporting is at theconsciousresistance.com. If you're interested in my docuseries, that's thepyramidofpower.net. And overall, I just encourage people to look into these ideas. Even if moving on the land isn't where you're at right now or doesn't really appeal to you at the moment, find ways that whatever your setting is, whether you're living in, a flat in the city or you're out, somewhere else with friends nearby, that you can start working to practicing your principles on the day-to-day level. If we don't actually put these principles into practice, if they're just abstract, just words on, in pages of books that we never actually live, then they're meaningless. The only thing I think that matters right now is for us to continue to educate and empower ourselves. Again, be an example for other people. And the way we do that is by actually living up to the words and the things we believe in. I don't think you shouldn't be a voluntarist on paper. You should be a voluntarist in life and in the way that you treat other people, the way that you model yourself. And especially if you are somebody with children or young ones around you, you want to model the kind of behavior that you want them to embody. So what better way to do that than by living that truth? So
wonderfully.
Yeah, thank you for having me on, brother.
Fantastic. Wonderfully put, Derrick. I couldn't add anything to that. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us, Derrick, and really appreciate what a wonderful conversation. It's great. I'm going to be following your your developments there with keen interest, and you're doing some great work. So thank you so much for everything you do. You've been amazingly productive in informing us all. So a very big thank you. And thank you very much to all of you for listening and indeed watching. And do remember to check out the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's loads more there, philosophical issues, tips on thinking skills, and all sorts of interesting articles. So check that one out. And I look forward to seeing you again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.